For example, in our country, people talk about the land will alleviate us from the poverty that we have.
Yeah.
But the very people who saying land first, if you go and ask individual people,
And actually wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you think the land should be returned to the people as the famous notion of like, we want the land back? Do you think the land should...
I'll come back to that. I'll come
Yeah.
back to that because I believe slightly differently, but I'll come back to that. But what I want to say is...
You don't believe the land should be...
I'll come back
given
to
back
it.
to you, okay.
Give me an opportunity. I'll come
Yeah,
back to
sure.
it. So I believe in private property.
You believe in private property?
I believe in private property being protected. So obviously I'm slightly different. I won't say the land should basically go to... all of the land should belong to the state.
Yeah.
And that the state should basically now make sure what they decide what they do with the land.
Okay. But another thing that really worries me is, it was a very heated conversation between yourself and Dr. Malusi Mncube, who is a very passionate Pan-Africanist. I mean, you can tell from...
I picked it up. I picked it up.
Yeah. So, but I just want to say that you were raising a point that individual responsibility is very important, that we shouldn't necessarily rely on the government or expect the government to do 100% work. We should also rely on ourselves and hold ourselves accountable or rather take that personal responsibility. And I raised a point actually which it didn't actually contradict with yours or went against yours, but I was just adding in response to what you were saying that, look, in terms of impact, it might differ. I feel like the government must, as much as we must take much responsibility, but on a bigger scale in terms of impact, the government has that responsibility. What is your view on that?
Yeah, so as I expressed my view, even when in my talk, what I was trying to say is, there's macro events, there's macroeconomic issues that happen that affect us. Mm-hmm. So maybe let me use an expression that we can all understand, where there are external factors and internal factors that lead to bad circumstances, that lead
100%.
That lead to poverty.
Yeah.
So for example, you can't go to people who have been actually deprived of their home because of a war and say, look, you are in poverty because you didn't take responsibility.
Of course.
You can't do that because it would be such an unsympathetic thing to do. So I agree with you that there are policies that government can put in place, and those policies have a real influence on people's lives.
Yeah.
And they have real impact on the structure of the economy. So government does matter. And I agree with you at that point. Where for me, I usually have a bit of a reluctance with focusing on that narrative is because it tends to be the only narrative.
Okay.
And when it becomes the only narrative, what starts happening is we start having a state of hopelessness.
Yeah.
Because if government can't do anything right, then what happens to us? Then basically there's really nothing we can do. Where else, what I'm saying is, if you try to do certain things in your area of influence, in your sphere of influence, if you start making those right decisions, in fact, what you will start realizing is enough people, if they focus on their area of influence, it tends to have a bigger impact in the community. The example that we could all use is the example around apartheid, how the political freedom was won. Political freedom didn't start with a mass action. It started with individual people taking individual responsibility and also preaching that same message to each other. And
but won't you say that was individual responsibility to fight the government? Not necessarily, yes, it was to better their lives, but to fight, the structural processes that were in place. So right now, the personal development that you're talking about is to better our lives. Or are you...
It's both.
Okay.
And I think this is where me and Dr. Malusi kind of are different, because he's looking at one that is similar to what happened with the political action. And for me, I'm saying you have to do both.
Okay.
While you fight the policies in government, while you basically try to agitate for change in government, also build.
Okay.
Also build.
Yeah.
Also take responsibility to look at what you can do in the community and build. Don't only complain that the government doesn't clean our streets, they don't bring people to clean our streets. Take up a broom as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's basically, when I talk about individual responsibility, I'm saying you have to do it on both fronts. That's why sometimes this becomes problematic, because people tend to think of it in a binary way. It's either I fight this way and no other way I can fight. But
Yeah.
I'm saying you can fight on both fronts. You
Yeah.
can fight to basically have the government implement what they promised to implement, but while doing that,
Yeah.
because you are fighting basically for a government to create the right environment so that you are able to thrive. But if you are not looking at opportunities of how you can thrive and exercise individual responsibility that way, even when the government starts opening the opportunities, you'll still be left with your pants down, because you haven't been doing some work trying to build stuff on your
Okay.
own.
Okay. Okay.
And that's basically what I'm trying to say. Fight for government.
So those opportunities should find you somehow,
doing something
in the process of yeah.
of working. I mean, in the process of you having had many failures.
Yeah.
Because now, for example, in our country, people talk about the land will alleviate us from the poverty that we have.
Yeah.
But the very people who saying land first, if you go and ask individual people,
And actually wanted to ask you a question. Do
Yeah.
you think the land should be returned to the people, as the famous notion of like, we want the land back? Do you think the land should...
I'll come
should-
back to that. I'll come
Yeah.
back to that, because I believe slightly differently, but I'll come back to that. But what I want to say is,
You don't believe the land should be...
I'll come back
given
to
back
it.
to you, okay.
Give me an
Sure.
opportunity. I'll come
Yeah,
back to
sure,
it.
okay.
So what I want to say is, if you fight for the land,
Yeah.
and I give you the land today, what are you going to do with it if you haven't been thinking about
Yeah.
commercializing and making sure that that land is worked?
Okay.
So in other words, you fight for government to do stuff for you, but you're not making sure you are equipping yourself. You're
Yeah.
not making sure you putting yourself in a position so that when the land comes,
Yeah.
you know what to do with it.
But then somebody can argue that
Yeah.
in my personal capacity,
Yeah.
I know a lot of guys that are in the agriculture space.
Yes.
I know a lot of guys that are in the property space.
Yes.
Which, of course, being in property means you need to, equip yourself
Yes.
in the land processes,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
As well as agriculture.
Yeah.
So somebody can say that, okay, the land, as we are busy saying, give back the land, give back the land, give back the land. We're not necessarily saying give back the land to an ordinary guy who's just walking in the street,
Yeah.
and he's not gonna do anything with the land once you have given them the land.
Yes.
But then there are people that are capacitated, like you're saying,
Yeah.
people who have been doing the work.
Yes.
That maybe there should be a selection criteria or some sort of a process that, of course, at the end of the day, will benefit the right people, and will be facilitated by processes that
Yeah.
allow the rightful people to own that land.
Yes, yes.
Do you agree with that notion?
So I believe in private property.
You believe in private
I
property?
believe in private property being protected. So obviously I'm slightly different. I won't say the land should basically go to, all of the land should belong to the state.
Yeah.
And that the state should basically now make sure what they decide what they do with the land.
Okay.
I don't believe in expropriation without compensation. So,
Okay.
like I said, if I believe in private property, obviously you can gather.
But what about the land that was taken without, compensation?
And I'm glad you raised that, because
Yeah.
I will say in that case, if there is evidence and if there's proof that
Yeah.
that happened, let the justice take its course.
But this was how many years ago?
let
So
the justice take its
the
course.
evidence is limited.
Yeah, but also we could also argue and say, all of us in South Africa, do you know we come from up north? So in Africa, so none of us actually originates from South Africa.
What about the Khoisans?
That you see, these are the people now we can talk about.
Yeah.
These are the people we can talk about, because these are the people who are already occupying Southern Africa.
Okay.
Now, those are the type of people, in my view, I still believe that there should be some form of justice that happens to those people.
But somebody can also argue to say, look, even if we come from the north,
Yeah.
when we came here, we didn't actually conquer the people and took the land. We somehow had some sort of, arrangement with the rightful owners of the land at that time.
Yeah.
And that's how, we became the owners of the land. Whereas, if you look at the Europeans, when they came in here,
Yeah.
it was forceful.
Yeah,
you know.
I would also dispute that point, because you see, when people say the land was forceful, all of it,
Yeah.
it's also not being honest, because some of the kings willingly gave the land.
100% not all of it.
Yeah,
Yes.
so that's why the land issue is a little bit more complex, and it needs to be nuanced.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we speak about the land, we speak as if all of the land was forcefully taken from people. And we have to also admit in the conversation that not all of it was forcefully removed,
Yeah.
taken from people. And if we can prove that,
Okay.
then it's fine. Let's let the justice take its course. But like you just said, you came, you got the land, but there was also someone who owned the land before you.
Yeah.
You know, when you came from north and
Yeah.
you came and you got a piece of land. Now, what about the person who owned it before you? Shouldn't he also get his own land back?
Maybe we can question on how I acquired that land.
That's another thing that for me,
Yeah.
I feel when it comes to the land discussions, those are the
Because
type
if
of
I
questions
acquired it
we
in a way that, you know, it was a mutual agreement or some sort of
Yes.
a bartering system that,
System,
you know,
yes.
took place in terms of like me and them exchanging, you know,
Yes.
a property
Yes.
and value in that sense, then that's a different story.
That's why I'm saying to you, the land issue is very complex.
Yeah.
And when we look
But
at
it
the
should
land,
be addressed.
Yeah. You know, yes and no.
Okay.
Right? And when I say yes and no, I'm saying in those cases where we feel we can prove certain things, let's address them. But I prefer a model of there was a white guy in the Stellenbosch, and I like what he did, because he owned the land and he had his farmers, and what happened, he actually was using the land for wine. And he took his farmers, he basically gave them a portion of the land, and he says, look, I'm going to give you this portion of the land, and you're going to work it and pay me back, and then you're going to start, you've been working for me anyway.
Yeah.
But now I'm giving you a piece of land, and I'm going to give you a skill as well.
Yeah.
And over time, ownership was transferred that way. What happened there is that guy made sure that he stayed in the business, and he gets the skill from the other guy. He learned the financial way of running things. And then completely that white guy like lost that portion of the land, and he gave it to his worker.
Yeah.
And I think that model, for me, it's a model that we are not even talking about it in South Africa.
But let's be honest, a lot of people, and especially white people that own the land in South Africa, thousands of hectares, are not willing to go that
Oh yeah,
route.
no. Look, that's an ideal circumstance, and
Yes,
I
yes,
agree
yes.
with you at that
And-
point. It's
and-
an
and
ideal
I'm recognizing
circumstance.
that. I'm not disputing it,
Yeah,
by the way.
and it's an ideal circumstance,
Yeah.
right? That's where now we have to start talking about. That's why I say the idea of no compensation for me doesn't work, because
Okay.
then this man, the way you have the land as it is in this form, the form it has now,
Yeah.
it's not the way he received it. He worked it, he improved it.
Okay.
And he has to be compensated for that labor.
For that time, obviously.
For what
sure.
he has done
Yeah.
to the land, so he needs to be compensated for it. And also, he might not even be the guy that we're talking about when we say, he got that land unjustly. He might be the guy who bought it from another guy. So the land issue is a very complex thing, and I think
Another guy who
nuance-
actually got it in a different way.
Yes,
So I understand the complexity around
there's
it.
There's a lot of complexities
yeah.
around it, and I think we're not recognizing those complexities.
Yeah.
And we're not even willing to talk about it. But
Yeah.
also for me, I think one more important thing that I think we're not talking about is we want the land, but if we get the land tomorrow, what are we going to do with it? Do we have business plans? Do we know what we're going to sell on the land? Is it viable land? People can't even tell you if that land actually can even, produce anything.
Some people just need land for accommodation.
But then why don't we just say that? Why don't we say that?
We have a problem of overpopulation, not the entire country, but in certain areas, like for instance in
Yes.
Gauteng. You
But that's
understand?
not how it's sold.
Yeah.
The way it's sold is that it's a solution to your poverty, which means it's going to be worked.
That's politics.
Because exactly. So if you're saying it's for residential purposes, that's another question. What type
Yeah.
of land is it? For what purposes are you going to
Yeah,
use the
sure.
land?
Yeah.
So a land issue is far more complex than what people realize. People make it a very simplified thing, but you can already see the questions I've asked now.
Yeah.
They make it very complex. How was it acquired? What is it used for? What are you gonna use it for when you get
It
it?
needs an entire commission.
So exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a far more complex issue.
Yeah.
I'm obviously someone who believes in private property. That's why. But I'm willing to say.
How many hectares do you own?
I mean, I don't own a lot of land. I own two houses. I don't really own a lot of land.
Okay.
But for me, if someone says all those two houses would be owned by a government, that's why I believe in private property.
Yeah, because you worked for those two properties.
I worked for those two properties.
Yeah,
and if I don't have a place where I can self-determine, if I don't have a place where I can exercise my own freedom, if I can't exercise my own individual responsibility, basically saying, if I can't have a place where I do that, where else would I do that?
Okay.
You know, and I can only do that in my house.
All right. Mr. Godana, thank you so much for your insights. I really appreciate hijacking you in this.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
But hopefully, because this is not a formal sit down, hopefully we can have a session later on where we have a studio session where we can record an entire podcast, 90 minutes long.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Where we can just talk about, expand on some of these things.
There's a lot of things to talk about. There's a lot of things we can talk about. And as you can see, my interests are wide. What I'm doing has nothing to do with what I've been talking about now.
Sure. But hopefully you will school me also in your department.
Yep.
I really appreciate your time. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a Break It Down. We're at the University of Johannesburg right here. I wanted to also interview the other speaker, but she said she's shy, but I'm going to take her contact details. Then we can organize. Me and Mr. Godana, we're going to have another session, a formal sit down, which he has already promised, and then we're going to break down a whole lot of things. Thank you so much.